This morning from John Nichols to associate myself with the comments. Really want to associate with what Ben just said, because in Minnesota we were one of the people who tried that, and it's brilliant. It's the example of creative, grassroots generated. You have a better chance with the lower level politicians these days, so it's a wonderful idea. There's been mention in the, I don't remember which sessions, of another very grassroots thing that very much goes with this, which is, I know Lisa Graves this morning mentioned the costs of war. That's a website that will actually quantify what, she says it's about $4 trillion right now what the wars have cost, and it will quantify by state, and there's another thing called Priorities Project, even by city, I believe. And so what you do with that knowledge is that you then go to your state legislature and your city councils, and you tell them to opt out of the war. And you say, this is costing us this much. We're over, our budget, our debt is this much, and we pass this resolution. Now your state legislatures, if they pass a resolution, it can go directly to the federal legislators. I was in a session this morning where we were decrying the fact that the politicians, the federal politicians especially, do not listen to the people. They listen to the lobbyists, they listen to the people who are campaign contributors. Well, state legislators can still get the ear of the feds for a lot of reasons. So these resolutions have a trickle up. And we've been talking about several of them. They're all really great ideas. I want to correct just the introduction slightly, which is that we're at the anniversary of 9/11, and I was not the investigator of the case in Minnesota where there was the suspect. In a couple of weeks, there's going to be even some more information coming out for all of you so-called conspiracy theorists out there. There's a lot of history and facts that were covered up. And so these things, as every anniversary, trickle out a little bit. What I did do, though, besides I wasn't the investigator, but I was the truth seeker or teller afterwards, 8 months afterwards. Because none of the responses to 9/11 had any bearing whatsoever on why 9/11 happened. I mean, the fit is just apples and oranges. And they're just almost opposites. What happens and occurs after 9/11, to include attacking Iraq, which is a country that is a buffer. It's a buffer zone against Al-Qaeda. So you attack the country that might have helped, actually. If you were really concerned about Al-Qaeda, you never would have attacked Iraq because Saddam was an enemy of Al-Qaeda. So these things are not just slightly askew, they're completely opposite of what the problem is. And to the point where I could hardly stand it 8.5 months later, and I write a memo that gets leaked to the public. And so the point here is that we are still in this mode, and we still have to tell the truth. 9/11 then does change everything. So I know people dispute that. Oh, it didn't really change. Shouldn't have changed anything. But because there's no truth for actually a couple of years, there's not even the slightest bit of truth coming out about why it happened. That you get these responses, and in actuality, I just drafted for a French paper. They're translating it into French, Dimanche, or Humanité Dimanche, or something like that. And I said 9/11 changed everything. We no longer have law in this country. So we're here to talk about the Constitution. How many read Glenn Greenwald? If you don't, you should. And he does a real good job of putting this in stark terms. I mean, the laws literally now do not exist. And there's a lot of reasons why the Constitution, and we can all talk about little aspects of it, but in Greenwald, the main things are the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, freedom of speech. I'm in Minnesota, and guess what happened in Minnesota? In the lead up to the Republican National Convention, all of our little groups planning picnics and marches all had infiltrators spying on us for no good reason. I was in a library in Northfield, Minnesota, a public library room with about 40 people. The one lady was talking about the march. One vet for peace was talking. He was going to have people dress up in orange jumpsuits, which they did the day before, and do a march. Our group was planning a picnic, and we had 3 of the 40 turn out to be law enforcement, terrorism task force people. And we actually know this now because the one officer who is in the back of the room. And again, there's only 40 people. And I'm a speaker, so he thinks when I speak and I look, I'm going to recognize him because he was on the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. And so he's hiding behind a woman in front of him. Now, I was so dumb and I was so, obviously concerned about telling about my picnic coming up that I didn't notice this guy doing this. That's a clue, by the way, if you got an infiltrator, if there's some guy who's trying to hide. His name is, he was a Bloomington police officer who was on the FBI's Terrorism Task Force, named Richard Grievous. And I'm going to use this, I was going to use it afterwards as a positive thing because I know a lot of people, when you talk about the surveillance, spying, all violative of the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, and all these things, when you talk about this in protest and activist groups, when you talk about the fact that now 23 anti-war activists in Chicago and in the Twin Cities are certainly under investigation. None of them have been charged yet, but they've been subpoenaed to grand juries. They've been raided. So when you talk about these things, what's the natural response? Well, I don't know what the percentage is, but at least 60–70% of the people I talk to who are good people and have maybe marched a couple of times, the first thing is to withdraw. I don't want to get on a list. I don't want to be stopped at the airport, all these things. So the first response is a fear. If I speak out, then if I'm taped, they'll go after me. And I want to tell you that there is a hidden benefit of the surveillance. This Richard Grievous, who sits in the back row, later retires from the police, and he writes a book. And one chapter in the book is about his efforts during the lead up to the RNC. And then about 4 or 5 months ago, there's an op-ed, he's been retired maybe 2 years now, there's an op-ed in our paper, and the title is, "We Need More Protesting Against the War." So when I tell people, don't be afraid, use it as a teachable moment. And I actually have the proof that, we were able, I don't know if it was us, but this guy has turned into now an advocate to end the war. And it's a pretty amazing thing. It probably wasn't us, but there's a cumulative effect here. So when you are being monitored, use it as a teachable moment. That's the positive side. I don't know how many people, I noticed there's like one person out there who heard me speak on secrecy. And secrecy is a large part of the root problem that is undermining the rule of law. If Ashcroft, after the Patriot Act, what was his response when people said, "Oh, this is bad, you're abusing civil liberties"? Do people remember what his response was? His response was, "Well, there hasn't been any complaint." And he said this for a couple of years. If there was a complaint, I think we know about it. The IG hasn't gotten any complaint. Well, of course, it's pretty hard to complain when it's secret. It took maybe several years to even find out about this spying. Now, I could complain about Richard Grievous because he finally wrote a book. But at the time, how can you complain if you got a national security letter? You don't even know if you're on the watch list. It's a suspicion if they haul you off every time, but you don't really know. Just to mark how this has progressed, and it didn't start overnight with 9/11. It was, the anthrax attacks, the sniper picking people off, the combination, the wars, all of these things slowly. But even the 9/11 Commission, when they are doing their write-up, they end up with 41 recommendations. I can't tell you all their recommendations. One was for the Tsar, the intelligence Tsar, and there's a few others. But 3 of those 41 recommendations deal with what? It's so passé now that nobody will even remember. They dealt with civil liberties. There was an extreme worry and concern on the part of lots of people, including even the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, that viewing what was starting to happen, they didn't know torture was happening at the time. They didn't even know that we were being warrantlessly monitored at the time. But they had enough knowledge to know that there's some very worrisome developments. And when you get this perfect storm going of people afraid and government saying they have to preempt, we're going to do everything, folks. Ashcroft, I do not apologize for anything we've done to protect the American people. When that's going on, And you get these factors that we will probably, there's a good chance, we'll start to repeat the COINTELPRO era. And J. Edgar Hoover's, from the 50s and the 60s, gathering information on people based on the threat of communism, and that we could well see this repeat. That was a worry. It was also a worry of even the FBI director. It's amazing now to see the transition over 10 years. People forget that he gave speeches. He was brand new then. He even got applause from the ACLU. Robert Mueller's first speech, he promised, he says, I'm well aware of the COINTELPRO era, and I promise you we will never repeat these abuses. It brought the House down. So people were worried. That Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which was 3 of the 41 recommendations, Bush did not want to do. He was forced to through an act of Congress. That December of 2004, they passed a law mandating it. So he was forced to set one up. He put 4 cronies on it and 1 Democrat who he thought he could control or whatever. And that fell apart because the one guy finally resigned in protest that it was being nullified. It was not being allowed to do its work about a year later. Again, our wonderful military congressional media complex, media did not cover this barely at all. But this was an incredible thing that the whole Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board had the rug pulled from under it, even though it's mandated by Congress. And so then, of course, that just ended then with Bush, but then Obama, who of course was campaigning on being a constitutional law professor. And of course that might mean that he might have to have this privacy, which is where our Congress went back and made it stronger. They actually strengthened the privacy. They did it a second time. Obama comes in and it's just completely out there, never has been reconstituted. I don't think he's ever, you might correct me on this, I don't think he's ever named anyone to this board that just sits out there in title only. And you don't even see anyone even bringing it up. It would make a big difference. I can tell you this, oversight is absolutely key to any constitutional, anything that's on paper, a right that's on paper, has to have a way of the people learning about it. It has to have some oversight, and it has to have some way of enforcing it. We have inspector generals in the Department of Justice. The one in the Department of Justice was Glenn Fine, and he was actually doing a fair job. Certainly he had his limits and he picked his battles, but he is the one, he's the only reason we know about some of these civil liberties abuses right now, including the infiltration of the Thomas Merton Center and the environmentalists. The only reason we know these things, the abuse of national security letters, is because there was an IG who took it on. In the CIA, probably Ray in the audience here can tell us more, but I know that there was one CIA IG who actually also did a fair job. And I just kind of deduced from reading things that eventually he did such a good job that it was like he was pressured to leave. So you can see that oversight works when they're actually pressuring some of these IGs and never, a lot of people said, oh, what difference, what a privacy board, that's a stupid thing. Well, the fact that it's never happened and it's been undercut to this extent, I think, in a reverse way shows you that somebody was afraid that with 5 people on there, we might get a General Taguba or somebody who would actually do something. All of these things, by the way, because they're so legit, this isn't like a liberal making this up. These are 2 congressional laws that passed, as well as the 3. So these are very fair game for people to be on right now, all over. And especially if you care about getting our constitutional rights back. We have to start somewhere. I want to follow up on what's been said a lot of times about, during the course, John Nichols especially has done such a great job because he's said this more than once. And he says, this tension between war and democracy, war and the Constitution. If you remember back to the Little Red Sign campaign, the Little Red Sign said, support the troops and the war. And so right off the bat I thought, oh my gosh, we could just plug in lots of things where war is going to hurt It's not just hurting the troops, there's a whole bunch of things. So we immediately did one, support the Constitution and the war. Ultimately, what Nichols said is you can't have a democracy with continual war. And he's paraphrasing James Madison. James Madison and the Founding Fathers understood this so well that if we continue, now we're 10 years. It's not a surprise where we are with the subversion of the laws and listening to, reading Glenn Greenwald's horrified discoveries that this has been violated and that's been violated. It's hardly a surprise because we've been 10 years in the war and we have a 70% consensus to end the wars. And the same people realize there are studied papers about the losing of Vietnam. The same generals who are trying to rewrite Vietnam history that Jane Fonda lost it for us. Jane Fonda, Daniel Ellsberg, and the liberal media lost Vietnam. If we could have, and Walter Cronkite and others, if we could have just kept up the public perception that we were winning on the war and that war was a good thing, if Walter Cronkite had not blabbed in whatever, 68, the new theory, there are papers, literally PhD papers published on this in the war colleges, we would have won Vietnam. So you can see that when this repeats now, that the enormous pressure for all of this consensus, going against this 70% consensus. And I think that's the real challenge, because if you realize that that consensus is not just on the left anymore because of the two-party bipartisan ping-pong, it's actually also on with the libertarians, with the Greens, with the independents, and even the fiscal conservatives who realize now that we're going to go bankrupt, those good old Eisenhower people who warned. And it is enormously important. I will just suggest, if you're interested, read Top Secret America, which is all about the surveillance and spying going on. It's a mind-boggling situation we're in. It actually is COINTELPRO on steroids, it's so much worse because of the technology. Back in the Hoover era, when they were spying on Pete Seeger and Burl Ives and the Hollywood people, they actually would send people in personally. They don't have to do that now. There's a lot of it is the vacuuming up of electronic information, email communications, telephone calls. I only see a couple people this morning. 1.6 billion pieces of data. So don't worry, you're on a list. 1.6 billion pieces of data. This is in the Washington Post. Every 24 hours is going into a government database on people. And I'll take questions later, but thank you very much.